Today, why this election should be about access to cash. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And I'm joined by a couple of guests today, Robbie Barwick, who you know, and also Alexis. Hello, Alexis. Good to see you.
Greetings.
And we should say, both of you, of course, associated with the Citizens Party.
Yes, you've been invaded by the Citizens Party, Martin.
Well, that's fine, and by me, and of course Alexis is a local candidate in Cunningham. We'll get onto that a bit later. But there's a really important conversation to be had about banking footprints, banking access to services. We know that people keep closing branches, and it's getting harder and harder to do business, even close into the cities, but in the regional areas, it's almost impossible.
Yep. The banks have been on a tear. We defeated the cash ban, the $10,000 cash ban, but since then we've seen more and more how, at a business level, the banks are determined to reduce banking services and get rid of cash out of the economy. And we have a policy to stop it. We want to use this election to make a name for that policy, to make sure we stop it. We'll be building on this just as much after the election's over, Martin. We're campaigning very, very hard on this. But this election's a good chance to educate people on our post office bank policy. And Alexis is the Citizens Party candidate there in Cunningham, who's on the hustings, on the ground, talking to people. And I think you get enough feedback there, Alexis, that you know exactly how important it is.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, before I came here, I was just on the phone to Dylan Green, who's the local candidate for the Greens, and discussing just the importance of it, because it's interesting how most people who are taking a stand in this election are not very familiar with the importance of a national bank. They don't quite understand how tied up the economy is with the privatisation of money and the control of the four big banks over the parties such as Labor and Liberal. So it's absolutely imperative from my point of view. I see most of my role is out educating the community, but also educating the candidates to understand why it is an economic imperative now. We've just seen the interest rate hike, and that'll continue over the next few reviews by the RBA. And they've got to do that because internationally they cannot fall behind despite the issues of inflation and rising prices, the cost of living. Australia has to accept that the game of how we live our life is changing. And we are the lucky country, but to remain the lucky country, we really need to keep forward thinking and working ahead of the game here, because so much of people's lives and livelihood and their savings is on the line right now. And Australians are just starting to have that big wake-up call. And when I speak to candidates, be it in Cunningham or other areas, that when they really comprehend the importance of reintroducing what was the Commonwealth Bank that was delivered through post offices, and the starting up now of the importance of retaining not just a post office network in Australia to support regional communities and an ageing population, but delivering the banking services through the post offices, and even more important, cash and the National Savings Post Office Bank. It's a mind opener for a lot of candidates.
And I can understand that some people say, well, it's a bit esoteric, isn't it, what you're talking about? But if you think about the fact that businesses and local communities need access to cash and banking services on the ground locally.
Absolutely.
And we've seen thousands and thousands of bank branches being removed from across the country, others where the opening hours are pretty much disappearing.
Yep.
And we know from our research that when local finance is not available, the economic prospects in that particular community go down. And Dale Webster's been doing some great work on the regional, showing just how far we've gone in terms of the loss of these core services. So what we're talking about is how we get core banking services back into the communities that need it.
Yeah, and we're focusing on the cash for good reason, because people can actually see, I think, and relate quite quickly to, if that's lost, there's all kinds of issues that have come up. You get you're trapped in banks, you're trapped under bank surveillance, even if the motivation is just so the bank can find more ways to profit from you. People should never be comfortable with that, but that's what you are. But then you're also at the mercy of the elements. You literally put at the mercy of the elements, because you'll always have natural disasters. The communications technology will fail and you can't transact. The poor people in Lismore went to their Woolies when the flood waters went down to buy food. They probably hadn't eaten for 2 days, and the Woolies had a sign, cash only, and none of them had any cash, right? Because everything was down. So it's crazy to have a system that is actively getting rid of cash in the community, and people can understand that. But what we want people to understand from that is, and it's why we talk about the post office bank, is because cash was one function of banking, and banking is actually so essential to how an economy actually works. Credit is the blood that flows through an economy, and the same banks that are now trying to get rid of cash purely for their own profits and control are the same banks that have been starving the productive sectors of the economy of access to credit, whether it be small business, regional communities, etc., shutting down bank branches. And if we don't address this, then the withering and dying on the vine that regional communities have been doing is going to, spread like a disease to more and more parts of the economy. And so we want people to understand how fundamental it is, but that our solution of, the Commonwealth Bank started in post offices because the network's there. We've got a network of post offices in Australia. They actually have financial difficulties. So if they combine their postal services with banking service, that's a solution for them as well, right? And we can quickly start a public postal bank and get this credit and services flowing again. And it'll be like the Australian outback when the rain water from Queensland trickles down, and into the lake air, etc., and all the what looks like desert suddenly turns into a flower bed. Flowers are blooming everywhere. That's what will happen to Australia's economy if we get this policy up.
Right. So the key question then is, what is the process, right? And I still don't think a lot of people get what a national bank is and why it's important. And I also think that a lot of people close into the centre of the major towns say, well, there are branches just around the corner. People don't realise just how far local banking has been demolished. I mean, just locally here, we used to have 2 of the 4 majors in the town. We've now lost them completely. We have to go down the road quite a long way. And, they're closing more and more branches. In other places, people are having to go hundreds of kilometres just to get basic banking services. That is not an acceptable position.
No. Did you see, so you referenced Dale Webster, who writes for the Regional. And I only read her latest article last night, Martin, and she ends with this beautiful line, just tell us where the bloody banks are. Because the bank regulator is required to keep a list of all the bank branches in Australia. And instead of providing addresses, it provides GPS coordinates. And this gets ridiculous. Dale Webster goes through these in great detail. Some of them are in public toilets. some of them are in the middle of paddocks, right? Why is the bank regulator playing this stupid game? Just provide addresses. So yesterday she observed that Nelson Bay in New South Wales there has just lost its 2 Westpac branches, and the people have to go to Salamander Bay, I think it's called, which is not that far away, but it is far away if you're an elderly person on what do they call it, a gopher, or someone on a walking frame, or just walking in general, right? Or at the mercy of public transport and whatever. It is far away. You're talking about a longer journey to go and do your basic banking services. And we can go through, there's lots and lots of cases of that around the country. But that's an example where the banks are the direction of the policy is into more shutdowns, not less. They're not opening up branches; they're shutting them down, right? But then answer me this: okay, just say the banks have, and we should talk about the bank's excuse on this, Martin, because you're a bit of an expert. But just to tie it in with what Alexis raised with us earlier about tradies, just say the banks, have an excuse to shut down the branches. Why are they ripping out so many ATMs? I remember in the 90s going into the bank and being encouraged to use the ATM. Clearly, it was, I was happy to. I was sick of the bank queues and whatever. But now they're ripping out ATMs faster at a rate that's faster than they're shutting down branches. Right? What does that serve? Except a specific agenda by the banks, and that actually has real consequences. Because, of course, the tradie can drive the extra 10 minutes to go to the bank branch if he needs to, but these people need to have access to cash in ATMs, etc., and that's getting harder and harder and harder. What's the logic there except just to serve themselves?
It seems to me that the banks are looking for any excuse to cut costs, and of course the ATM is a small cost, but they have to keep putting the notes into the machine. But it is weird when you bear in mind that there's more cash in circulation than there's ever been.
Yep.
And we also know that a lot of regional businesses in particular do still use cash a lot. So the old argument from the banks is, well, everyone's moving digital, so you don't need cash now. Everyone's got apps on their computers and on their phones, and everybody settles electronically. So the digital revolution is now here, and even old people, are quite happy to use the digital mechanisms too. But that's way too simplistic. Not least, have you tried using digital in some of the regional areas where the communications are pretty poor? Or indeed, sometimes it's just more convenient to use cash. And, we fought the cash ban because we knew it was really important to keep cash in the community. And it's interesting, in New Zealand, they've been surveying quite recently the use of cash. And they're actually saying cash is going to maintain its position in the community and in the society into the future. So they actually believe there's a future for cash. I think the banks here in Australia really are just wanting to get rid of cash, and I think that's a big problem.
Well, it's about cost cutting as well, because having owned and run businesses myself and being a COVID casualty, if you like, for having to shut our fairly substantial business locally, and moving across into trades and construction, I can see that, first of all, many of my peers were reliant on cash, especially during COVID, because, like it or not, that was what the transactions that people wanted to move towards, because it was more personal. It's a state of economic fairness, so that you're allowing people to make their own choices and not to be monitored for the financial choices that they make, because assuming that people get taxed fairly, and that the reality is that there is a lot of economic creativity when it comes to cash at the grassroots level, and small businesses such as cafes and little restaurants and boutique producers or people that have got a hobby business. You find that cash is a really important part of maintaining their subsistence living standards, and also about feeling comfortable to try new innovations or look at different ways of functioning economically in their direct area or their region.
And avoiding bank charges too, Alexis.
Well, avoiding bank charges, that's right, because why should we be supporting the profitability of the banks? The reality is that these institutions are systemically influencing how we function economically to a level which is unfair, and it's unjust and likely, even if we look at it more deeply, unconstitutional. So therefore people have a right to free trade. They have a right to use their cash as and when they feel is appropriate, without all these micro controls being imposed by the profiteering of the banks. We all know, and especially if you've been around for a long time in business and construction, that it's imperative that cash remains in the economy, because it's a sense of direct fluidity. You start to lock that up and you'll notice that people start spending less, not spending more. They'll find other ways to subvert money so that they're, for instance, not paying taxation, or they do a lot more trade in cash. So it creates a bit more transparency, surprisingly enough, which is also what the government is seeking to accomplish as well. But these controls over people's financial well-being is actually creating, I guess, a subversion in what they're trying to accomplish.
So you're talking about the right of people to cut their costs in the way they operate, and cash is important for that. But of course, the banks, the banks think they're the only ones that should get to cut their costs, right, at the expense of everybody. And one of the problems, and we'll get to this will lead us in the direction of our policy solution. One of the problems when you have a banking system like Australia is it's dominated by 4 big banks, who I do think collude. I mean, they probably hang out at the Melbourne Club or somewhere and over brandy and cigars, but you'll never be able to prove that. They'll never claim they do, but they don't even have to really. It's like 2 service stations on the same street. They can see each other setting their prices and just match it, right? Martin will remember at the Royal Commission, it came out, one of the answers by one of the banks is, oh, we couldn't do that until we saw what the other banks were doing. These banks do indirectly collude if they don't directly collude, and they're a cartel, right? They're an oligopoly, and they have a monopoly over the financial system. And by them all deciding that it's in their interest to get rid of cash, they can force the rest of us to change our behaviour and the way we function, right? And this is bad. So one of their excuses, and we should debunk this right now, Martin, you know this better than anybody, is it came up at the recent hearing where Senator Malcolm Roberts did a really good job questioning APRA, the bank regulator, about its database on bank branch closures. And Malcolm Roberts' questions were informed by Dale Webster's work. And he even cited Dale Webster's work, which is, excellent stuff. So Wayne Byers, the chairman of APRA, just casually, as if it's a self-evident truth, said, yeah, banks are shutting branches because they're not profitable. Now, I think that's the biggest pile of steaming horse, ever. It's just rubbish. Banking is a special business. It's almost impossible for banking to not be profitable. Mm-hmm. Anyway, there's a couple of examples. I've got one, and I know you've got one too, Martin. The banks are cooking the books on this. So take a remote area where the town will be small, but the farms will be big, right? So these can be really, this is paradoxical. Some of the biggest rural accounts that banks have will be in some of the tiniest areas. And those accounts are very profitable for the banks. So what they do is they move the account from the local little town, the little 500-person town, to the next centre, whatever it might be, 20, 15,000 people, 10,000 people, right? And they move that account there, so the local branch loses this very profitable account, which would easily justify keeping that branch. It's still probably still profitable anyway, but the banks can say, oh, see, that's not as profitable. We can shut that one down. And that little town is just left to wither and die. And this is cooking the books. And I've got no doubt in my mind, Wayne Byers knows this is how it's done, but they just accept it as a self-evident truth. So I'm calling BS on that. And you've got your own example, Martin, of the way they cook the books.
Well, if you think about it, banking is all about accounting insofar that you've got distribution points and you've got products and you've got other elements, but they can make allocation decisions about which part of the profitability goes where and which part of the costs go where, right? I know because I actually spent many years working in banking and dealing specifically with how you cost a branch network and how you cost the rest of the bank. And you can make some different assumptions as to where those costs live, and you can completely change the economics of different channels or different product sets. And there's always a squabble between the distribution guys and the product guys as to how much of the revenue they actually should get and how much of the profit they should keep. So this is not as black and white as many in the banking system would like to present it, right? There are a series of decisions taken by senior people in the organization about how they choose to cut their costs and where they choose to throw money and profit. What, of course, has been done in recent times is to argue that the branches themselves are intrinsically unprofitable, despite the fact they at the same time tries to use the branches to sell more home loans and other things too. But it all goes down to how you precisely spread the costs over the revenue. And they'd argue, well, the foot traffic is falling, and it may be falling in some places, but isn't that partly because it's less available and less accessible? So, it becomes a mutually reinforcing problem. And then they say, gee, look, I'm losing more money there, so we need to chop this branch and chop that branch. But I come back to a very important point in my mind. I think there needs to be a social responsibility and actually a social license. In other words, we should have a service obligation from our banking system to provide basic services to everybody across Australia, whether they're in a town or whether they're in the country, wherever they are. Because, as we said earlier on, it's absolutely critical to enable the economic momentum in those particular parts of the country to work properly. And yet, what's happening at the moment is that the banks are running to the exits. They're trying not to be the last branch in the locale because they always get the biggest flack. But the net result is that more people are finding it harder to do the things they need to do and want to do, and are, well, maybe being forced online if they can find an online service to fit, but quite often have no other choice.
I think there are two other issues that come out of that as well, which is where you're talking about keeping that opportunity for people to transact locally. We've got to think about what's the future of Australia. It's not about being profit driven with the banks. It's about maintaining the service in community to support an ageing and very diverse community. So importantly, access to the branches, and the National Post Office Bank would be delivered obviously through the post office, but we're also looking at things like food security. We want to keep family farmers local. We want to encourage people to be growing and cultivating small businesses or hobby businesses locally for their long-term food security, and that's going to require transactions that are probably more frequent and also cash-based transactions, and maybe even the access to seed capital at a very local level. They're going to need access to people who want to get to know their local economy. And so whilst this has been withdrawn from smaller towns and regional areas, the requirement as we look into the future is that we're going to need more of it. So is it the profit motive or is it the service motive for the greater well-being of our communities?
Well, let me spin that slightly, because if you actually have more people using those local services and creating more economic activity, guess what? You actually create more value in the process too. So rather than actually a downward spiral, you can actually create a spiral into greater prosperity in the regions, which is presumably what we really want.
Yeah, absolutely. You can imagine that cash helps things flourish at a grassroots level. That's probably one of the most important things for the greater electorate and also the candidates to really understand going into this process is that, these aspects that the Citizens Party has been working diligently on, especially Robbie for many years now, is helping people comprehend that banking as we know it and cash as we know it, it needs to change. It needs to evolve with where our economy and our society is evolving towards as well. And that includes things like looking at, the bail-in loophole.
Yeah.
That comment. I love Robbie's comment about big enough you could drive a Mack truck through it. Yeah. Do you want to state something about that, Robbie, for coming into the election now?
Well, because what I've got here is a checklist of benefits of the Post Office Bank policy, including that's number 2 on the list. Let me just go through the checklist, and you guys can comment as you will. But this is a checklist I've compiled over time just to explain the benefits of this specific policy. Why I call it win-win-win, and you can just keep adding the wins to it. And the only ones that won't win are the private banking oligarchs, right? Anyway, so first, if we establish a post office bank in Australia, where all post offices are branches of this new public bank, all Australians will have close access in terms of proximity to face-to-face banking services. And so all the communities that are losing their banks and not happy about it, they can actually look at it and say, oh, well, okay, if you don't let the door hit you on the way out, right? Get lost then. We've got a bank and this bank will stay here. Totally change the dynamic. What I can tell you will happen, because again, it was Dale Webster who pointed this out, and Martin and I have talked about it before, the 1982 Canberra report that demanded the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank predicted that when it was privatised, banks would start shutting their branches. Why? Because they wouldn't have to compete with the public bank anymore. So if you reverse that, you get a public bank back, and the public bank sees, as happened in New Zealand, Martin, our mutual friend John Darlson, told me, because he was a director of the ANZ at the time when New Zealand set up Kiwi Bank. And of course, ANZ's a big bank in New Zealand. It's Australia and New Zealand Bank. And he said, as the board, they were shocked at how many deposits flowed into Kiwi Bank. They couldn't believe it, right? People in New Zealand wanted to bank with something other than their version of the Big Four, which is owned by Australia's banks and a public bank. So when the banks see that and they're having to compete with a private bank, they're not going to want to lose that many customers after all, right? And they're going to start keeping their regional branches open and actually probably opening some more. So anyway, that's the first one. Ensure all Australians have close access to face-to-face banking services. Second, and this brings me to bail-in, give Australians a place where they can have 100% security for their savings. And that's security that is because it's owned by the government, and the government, can't go broke. Well, I mean, governments can go broke, of course. They can fail. You can have a failed state, defaults on its debts. But if that ever happens to Australia, your cash will be the least of your problems, right? That's the end of the world. That's the apocalypse.
Well, I think you have to just, on that point, Robbie, probably address people's fears that if they did move their money from one of the 4 big banks into the government bank, you're going to have a bit of a risk analysis, really, aren't you, about if something goes down, where is your money going to be safer? But also, can you trust the government? That's a question that comes up a lot when you start talking about a national bank.
Well, no, okay, that's true. So, but you've got to understand all this stuff, including the deposits in the deposit accounts in banks will still be governed in the postal bank. The post office bank will still be governed by, terms and conditions. That's the effect. That has the effect of a contract. The government, the excuse the government has for bail-in in a private bank is because these are unsecured deposits, and the private bank is essentially being allowed to default on a percentage of those unsecured deposits. But that private bank would have to be in a deep crisis to be given that permission to do that. So what people have to understand about the government bank is that the government wouldn't have an excuse. It would be outright stealing from people if they said, "Okay, we're not going to give you half your money back." Right? That would become constitutional and become an issue and all sorts of things. Right? You don't have to. I don't think people have to have that fear. What's happened in the since 2008, or even before it with us, because we were warning there would be a crash. But especially since 2008, I can tell you now, if there had been a public bank option in Australia from 2008 onwards, it would be the biggest bank in this country by far already. People wanted to move their money really fast into the most secure option. And they would be saying to the Citizens Party, where do we put our money? And we couldn't tell them because there wasn't such an option, right? So anyway, it's 100% secure, and you're safe from the other things the banks do that the post office bank wouldn't do. The banks gambling on derivatives and those sort of things. They wouldn't be doing that, right? So it wouldn't be doing the things that get them into trouble, and it wouldn't be at risk of a bail-in because the excuse of a bail-in is a bank failing, and there'd be no reason for a post office bank to fail because it's ultimately owned by the government. And Craig Isherwood and I spoke about this today on our show because one of the most beautiful quotes from Australian banking came from Denison Miller in 1912 when the Commonwealth Bank opened its doors. And he made this announcement on the day the bank opened its doors. And this is what he said: this bank is opening without any capital. I'm paraphrasing, but pretty accurately because I know the quote well. This bank is paraphrasing without any capital. This bank is opening without any capital because it is backed by the entire wealth of the people of Australia. That's what being owned by the government meant. You could think of a public postal bank as a bank of the people, for the people, by the people, right? That's the most democratic bank you can have. That's what it would do. So 100% safety for deposits. Third, it would maintain the post office network. And we know this is very important. And it's interesting, I'm in Melbourne. Of course, you two are up there in Wollongong. And so is our mutual friend, Angela Cramp, who's the executive director of the Licensed Post Office Group. And it was Angela who taught us just what the Licensed Post Office Group is, what licensed post offices are. They're in a very important part of Australia Post, but they're small business licensees. And until Christine Holgate came along, they were going broke. And Christine Holgate had this idea to combine banking and postal services to create extra revenue to maintain the post office network. It works around the world. That's what will work in Australia, right? It's a beautiful solution because post offices are a very, very essential service. They're one of the most essential services going around. They're one of the oldest public services going around for that reason. And whatever we think is going to happen with technology, the post office will always be a very important service. And you don't want, an excuse to start shutting down the postal network. It's got a very broad footprint in Australia. It's got the best retail footprint in Australia. They all become banks, and the banking will help maintain the post office network, make all the LPOs viable for in perpetuity. Now, these last few, I think, are the most important in terms of what it will actually do for the economy. A post office bank will restore local banking. And that means I'm talking now about the loans, the lending side of it, because it'll be a safe place to put your deposit. But what it can do in the lending side of it, it would be encouraged, like the bias of the lending policy would be back into the local communities where the deposits are coming from. Right, as the Licensed Post Office Group, I should say, last week put out an election call for political parties to say, look, this is what needs to be done for Australia Post, and it has a whole bunch of things for Australia Post. But one of the things it calls for is a post office bank, and it stipulates to support small and medium enterprises and invest in infrastructure, and that's so important. And that's what the postal bank can do. Those small businesses who, I'll give you an example. In the United States, Bernie Sanders is trying to bring America's post office bank back. They used to have one until the 1960s. And of course, the private banks ganged up on that as well. He's not thinking very ambitiously, and he should. But nevertheless, what he's saying, what he's proposing is pretty, you can see the reasoning of it. He wants this bank to be able to just issue even little loans, right, of $1,000, mainly so that the average American no longer has to use these payday lenders, right, who charge them, the interest rate of payday lenders is just astronomical when you actually add it up, what they're actually being charged. And Americans are trapped in this poverty cycle with that. And he wants to break the back of that, using the post offices as the bank, where those people can instead go to the post office and say, lend me $1,000 on much more reasonable terms, and just so they can basically survive. Well, we can do that, but we can do it on a proper scale with proper banking. But our emphasis should be on getting the investment back into local communities. And I think one of the selling points of this bank will be local councils. Picture this. Now, the local councils have never had more responsibility, but never had less money. And they're all banking with one of the big four. Almost all of them will be banking with one of the big four. Imagine if they moved all their accounts into the post office bank, and which will be a massive boost to the post office bank. But in return, what do they get out of it? They can borrow from the post office bank on the best possible terms for all that local infrastructure they've got to build and maintain, right? That they often have to wait for, well overdue grants for, and, all this sort of stuff. And it's just a pain in the neck. The post office bank will help to keep credit circulating at that level. So local banking. The next point is cash availability, which we've already talked about. Maintaining the cash payment system, very important. Break the monopoly of the big four banks over Australia's system, very, very important. That's probably the most, in my view, that's why, one of the reasons we really got involved in this policy. And I predict this bank would attract so much in the way of people's savings deposits. Not only would it be able to would there be plenty of credit to lend to local demand for small businesses, etc. This bank could be something that the governments, all the governments, the federal government, the state government, and the local governments tap into for all infrastructure projects of all kinds. So if you put your money in the post office bank, you'll get your normal bank interest, you'll get your security, you'll get your access to cash, but you can also know that your bank is helping to develop the economy of Australia for the benefit of everybody. So that's my checklist. What do you think?
Brilliant. Well, I can see that distinction of personalising banking again, as opposed to depersonalising it. As we move into this next stage of our economic development in Australia, it's going to be so important to bring this down to a regional and local level, because only through those relationships and that economic understanding can we put the money, the seed capital, the infrastructure money, where it's going to be most effective. And you can't centralise those decisions. There's too much information and there are too many dynamics. So repersonalising it through having this kind of, financial support back out in local communities with more skilled people in the communities, in the post offices themselves, you're suddenly getting this whole employment uplift, as well as the economic, the social, mental wellbeing, and the seed capital to regenerate the small businesses that have been so affected by the whole health crisis.
100%. They're all victims of a banking system that's structured to take in their money and then divert it to what's in the biggest the interests of the banks in terms of what's most profitable. And that's speculation on housing, which has given us the most unaffordable housing bubble in the world, derivatives, all sorts of crazy stuff. And it's come at the expense of the Australian economy. People, after all this time, you gradually get used to it. Unfortunately, I think people need to, cast their mind back to the days when banking was more local. It wasn't privatised. There was a public option. Governments did take responsibility for infrastructure, etc. And you don't have to fall for this insidious lie that there's some kind of evolution of economics such that pining for days past is impractical and the economy's moved on. No, the economy is the system that meets our needs for food, clothing, shelter, transport, energy, communications. That's the economy. That's what expedites our ability to interact with each other. That doesn't change. Technology gets better in some respects, but the basics don't change. So the basic interface between the financial system and that shouldn't change that much either.
So I guess just in closing, we mentioned Cunningham earlier on, right?
Yep.
Let's just come back to Cunningham, because you've been around the Electorate, you've seen a lot of stuff there. Where do you think this idea of banking and local commerce fits in the hierarchy of people's concerns at the moment?
So people glaze over pretty quickly when I start talking about a national banking strategy or a national post office bank. But when you start talking about the things that are going to directly affect their life, so that they won't be able to have cash, that they can't put cash in their grandkids' Christmas cards, and that they won't be able to go to the market or to, we're part of the Dapto Community Farm, that you won't be able to go and give a couple of bucks to get the food that you need at a reasonable price. Suddenly, if you're going to be having to use a card and then adding a transaction fee to something you're paying a couple of dollars for, for people who are living on the sniff of an oily rag, these are critical questions. So I've got to say that having come from a small business background and knowing a lot of other small business owners in the Cunningham area, that the moment you start talking about this very specifically, about how it's going to specifically and directly affect what they can and cannot do, then suddenly you do start to get that engagement. But it is very much an education process for even the business owners to comprehend. Maybe they don't already use the post office bank, but there is banking services available through the post office, but a national bank sponsored and delivered through the post office is something distinctly different. So it's about holding people's attention long enough to understand why this is such a critical issue. And I find when I speak to them about, watch the video on the Citizens Party website. If you feel compelled, go and sign the petition so you get more information about it, read some articles. Like, you've got to educate yourself about these economic imperatives so that you can get behind it. The Citizens Party has been working on this for a long, long time. And I think what they've also come across in, be it in speaking to the public or speaking to politicians or getting into the mainstream media, is that people's lives are directly affected by money, but they don't really want to talk about it. What is that about? Why have you been so visionary around this, Robbie, with the Citizens Party, and why do you think that people like Liberal and Labor just aren't?
Oh, well, I mean, our party started when Craig Isherwood started it in 1988. Think about 1988. It was 5 years into Hawke and Keating. Banking deregulation had already happened. And in Craig's case, he often cites, by then interest rates had hit the 17 and 18%, et cetera. And the people who got political at that time, they knew that there was something about these financial changes that were having a big impact on the economy, and that was the catalyst that forced them to look at it, right, and actually educate themselves on what that meant. Now, because our party's been around so long, we've been able to do a lot of work, and we've been able to do a lot of work on financial policy and a lot of work on history, and the two have reinforced each other. Right, because we could identify where the policies we criticised and that we said had a negative impact. We could identify how much they tied into this financial deregulation wave that happened in the 80s, and then our history work. We just, the way we summarise the political history of Australia is that it's been a 100-year fight or a 120-year fight over a public bank. That's been the fight, and I can spend the next 10 hours telling you the story, right? The big fights. And when it got really tense was always over banking. 1949 with Ben Chifley and what he did. 1975, banking was a very big part of what happened with the Whitlam government because, the Treasurer, Jim Cairns, told me he knew they didn't have to go overseas and borrow loans to fund their program. Now, their program, might I remind you, to Wollongongers. What do you call people from Wollongong anyway? Is there a name for you? Anyway, I'm going to call you Wollongongers. The Whitlam government's program was led, the visionary was the member for Cunningham, Rex Connor, right? He wanted to buy back the farm. He wanted to develop Australia's resources, and he was supported across the party. But Jim Cairns knew that the Labor Party then, because of what happened at Chifley, wouldn't be game to fund it the way they should have. And they should have used the Reserve Bank, Australia's public bank. They should have used that. Instead, they went overseas. And so these are the things that it's always been central. And then, as far as I'm concerned, Hawke and Keating sold out on this question, right? So we did all this history. We've put it all together. We've identified the banks as the leading vested interests in the economy. This is true right around the world, right? And and Martin knows the structures as well as anybody with the Bank for International Settlements and that concept that's focal point for all the world's central banks, etc. And the way the policies that come out of this machine, this financial machine now, are designed to support the financial machine first and foremost, right? Its purpose of serving the economy comes second. And so you got all this crazy QE stuff and unconventional monetary policy, et cetera. And it's just got worse and worse and worse. The whole system should have pulled the pin, in 2008. So then we know all that. And then what we've also known is when it comes to actually examining the problem points in the Australian economy, the way it interfaces with banking is all important. And so we have a really keen sense that addressing this lays the foundation for addressing everything else, right? That's why we do it. And I think what we've identified here is a very easy way. We don't like being simplistic as a political party, but sometimes the solutions are fairly simple, right? a post office bank is a very, very easy way to get a public bank started again that begins the changes that we need. So I just want a little bit of a plug for the viewers here in terms of the election, because there's 2 weeks to go in this election campaign. The licensed your local post office, the group that represents your local post office small business owner has put out a call for a post office bank. We need all the candidates in this election to be challenged on where they stand on that. Get them to respond to the licensed post offices group call for a post office bank. Will they support it? Unfortunately, there's no central database of names at the Electoral Commission this year for the first time. So you're going to have to go digging for the candidates' contact details yourself in your electorate to find them. But if you're in Wollongong, look up Alexis, right? She'll talk to you. You know where she stands though. Find out where they stand on this issue. And I would also encourage people, as part of that, don't just go to the candidate, because so much of this is very essential to how local communities work. Go to your local council as well. Talk to the councillors. Explain to the councillors that the licensed post office group, the group representing all the post offices, has called for a public post office bank. Ask your councillor if they support that. And if they do, get them, and councillors are usually pretty well connected, get them to approach the major party candidates, all the candidates, frankly, but they'll know the ones that are most likely to win and all that. Approach the candidates as well. Get them involved in this. Let's get a debate. Let's make this post office bank policy a focus of the debate for the last 2 weeks of the election, because I can assure you we will continue the campaign as soon as the election's over. Elections are almost like a speed bump for us when it comes to campaigning, that you got to do them, right? And we're having fun with this one. Alexis is fired up. But we will be campaigning just as hard for this after the election, because I think this is a policy we can get up. We just have to build the awareness, and with the awareness will come the support, because people do want this kind of alternative. Yeah. So please do that. Get involved in it that way. Don't be a passive observer of the election for the last 2 weeks. Be an active observer. Get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I know from my experience and speaking to other people in Cunningham, going to the rallies in Canberra during the period of the mandates, and speaking to people at a federal level, that there is a lot of ignorance and confusion about what a national bank means and the opportunity around it. But from my experience, I think that the Citizens Party is more Labor on this than Labor. Well, old Labor.
Yeah.
Some of those, really supporting Labor at a grassroots level, but then also understanding that you've really got to focus on the social, emotional, mental, economic well-being of people now. That's the most important thing to be questioning your candidates about as we go into this election.
Yep.
Well said. And, my last thought is this. Banking should be boring, right? It should be a facilitator and enabler of businesses and households and communities doing the things they want to achieve. It shouldn't be there to drive massive profits in its own right. It shouldn't be dominating the agenda. It shouldn't be dominating and influencing the political domain the way it currently is. We need to put banking back in its box, and actually the National Bank and getting those banking services into the local communities is a critical measure of success. So when it comes to the election, folks, ask these hard questions of your candidates and make sure that people understand how important local banking is.
Absolutely. And if you're in Cunningham, of course, I'm going to say put us number one at the top of your paper, because with somebody like me coming into Cunningham, on behalf of the electorate, over 160,000 people, it's a massive responsibility representing those needs at a federal level. But you don't just get one person, you get our entire policy team that can help make this happen even faster. Thanks, Martin North. Thank you, Robbie.
Thanks, Alexis. I'd vote for you.
You're in the wrong place, mate.
Yeah.
I'm in the wrong place, but I tell you what, every vote for the Citizens Party
is a vote for the National Bank.
Is a vote for the bank, and the major parties will know that, right? So however well we do, it doesn't matter. They will get what that vote means. So
I'd just like to say I've released my preferences today, and I had a long conversation with, I know Kath Blakey, who's a councillor in Wollongong, spoke to Dylan Green, who's standing for the Greens, who's a very vibrant, intelligent young man. And the Greens I've put above Labor and the Liberals locally, because they are fighting for a national bank in the background, and maybe it's not at the forefront of their policies, but it isn't even on the agenda for Liberal and Labor, and people need to be very, very clear-minded when they go into this election, who they're voting for and where they stand on the national bank policies.
There's a lot of support out there. We just have to galvanise it.
Absolutely.
Well, folks, thanks very much for your time today. Very important conversation. And I have a feeling this election is going to be a real linchpin election, because so much of the future of Australia, it depends on making the right decisions on May 21. So hope this helps. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.